Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable, and the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
The Australian government, given our close relationship with the United States, beyond the Trump administration, has a lot of leverage to use there, and it's in, I would argue that it's in Australian interest to support the institutions of American democracy and to work with people who have an interest in them surviving and thriving.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. The Trump administration is continuing to wreak havoc at home and abroad.
We begin with Elon Musk doubling down on his ultimatum to federal workers to explain what they did last week.
Because we have people that don't show up to work and nobody even knows if they work for the government.
The Trump administration's slashing of the federal government workforce is hitting home far beyond the nation's capital. Some 80% of the federal workforce is outside D.C.
I think everyone thought it was a pretty ingenious idea.
Elon Musk and his cronies are tearing through the US federal government, firing government employees, demanding access to sensitive data and undermining critical public services. And at the same time, Trump is aggressively reshaping global politics.
The US will take over the Gaza Strip and we will do a job with it too. I don't want to be cute, I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East, this could be something that could be so bad, this could be so magnificent. And I think I have the power to end this war. And I think it's going very well. But today I heard, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed.
The international rules-based order that America so often evangelised, even if it really followed its own teachings, has been jettisoned. And US foreign policy is being remade in Trump's image. Joining me today to talk about what's happening in US politics and what it all means for Australia is Director of our International and Security Affairs program, Dr. Emma Shortis. G'day, Emma.
Hey, Eb.
Thanks so much for joining us. There's always so much to get through when it comes to what's happening in US politics.
Yeah, always, but it's always a pleasure to be here.
So I want to start with Europe and Ukraine, because last week, obviously, Trump officials met with their Russian counterparts about ending the invasion of Ukraine, but they did it without Ukraine or European allies in the room. And he said some pretty horrendous stuff about Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky.
A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast.
So I guess, what does this mean for Ukraine and European security more broadly, that they're doing this just with Russia?
So I think, Eb, we're only beginning to understand the immediate implications for Ukraine. This is something Trump has promised for a long time. He ran a lot of his election campaign on the promise that he would end the war in Ukraine on day one. He extended that out a little bit, but he's kind of getting to that point now. So it's not a surprise that, he's initiated, or his administration has initiated, these talks directly with Russia. I think there has been some shock in Europe and in Ukraine that they haven't been included in this first round of talks at all. Like, that is pretty astounding that the future of Ukraine is being decided without any Ukrainians in the room. So the implications of that are pretty significant for Ukraine, and the Trump administration has been making noise about what would be some pretty unacceptable concessions for Ukraine in terms of territory and sovereignty and the future of their democracy. But Trump, as we know, is not interested in that. He doesn't care about democracy at home, let alone democracy abroad. He's interested in pursuing a relationship with Putin's Russia. So the implications of that for Europe more broadly, which is part of what you are asking, are hugely significant. And again, they were previewed. I think Europe has known that something like this might be coming for a long time, but that doesn't mean that it's not a shock when it actually happens. When you have Trump administration officials meeting with Russian officials directly and kind of speaking as if the war isn't necessarily even relevant. They were talking about their economic relationship. So the implications of that for Europe and for NATO more broadly are hugely significant, and Europe is reacting quite strongly. So in Germany, for example, the person we think will be the Chancellor has come out really strongly about Europe needing to develop its own independence because it's wedged on either side by Russia and the United States. So, none of this is hugely surprising, but it is having pretty huge, I guess, repercussions in Europe.
And I mean, obviously, as you said, Europeans have been kind of prepared for this kind of thing, but it's still a massive shock and a disruption when it happens. Has the European response been similar across the board? Are they all kind of really working in concert on this? Or, is their response coherent and united, I guess?
Not hugely coherent, Eb. Europe historically has a fair bit of difficulty kind of being coherent, especially in its foreign policy. Certainly, the prominent leaders like the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, have come out really strongly in support of Ukraine. Macron convened his own summit of European leaders in response to the Trump administration's actions, but he didn't invite everyone in Europe. Some European leaders were quite annoyed that they weren't included in those conversations. And of course, there's a lot of diversity politically across Europe as well. The states that are closest to Russia have quite strong views, understandably, about the potential resolution of this war, while the states further away, the French, for example, even the British have, I suppose, less, or they feel they have less of a direct interest in this. And so they are making some contradictory statements about things like, putting troops on the ground, for example, if it came to that. So I think there's been some pretty familiar disappointment within Europe about that kind of inability, I suppose, to unite. But it has been really interesting in the last few days seeing stronger statements, I think, come out of Europe, particularly, as I said, out of Germany around what this means for Europe's alliance with the United States and how European countries should respond. I think there's a great deal of, I'm not sure if resentment is too strong a word of what is, I think, widely regarded as a betrayal by the United States of a long-standing alliance. So, it's got a lot to play out yet, and Trump may walk things back somewhat as he tends to do, but it does seem like the ground is shifting pretty quickly in Europe.
Mm. In terms of what Trump is saying specifically, he's kind of talked about wanting to access Ukrainian critical minerals and talking about how much Ukraine owes the United States and what they'd recover from them.
I want them to give us something for all of the money that we put up. So we're asking for rare earth and oil, anything we can get.
As well as obviously those comments about Zelensky kind of causing the invasion. What does this reveal about the kind of ally that the Trump administration intends to be for Ukraine?
Look, I think this says everything about the kind of ally the Trump administration is to, not just to Ukraine, but to America's traditional allies more broadly. Trump has made it abundantly clear that he effectively just wants to rinse Ukraine for all it's worth and pursue a relationship with Putin's Russia. In his talk about accessing, Ukraine's critical minerals, for example, he's made that abundantly clear. And the way he has framed that relationship as being entirely transactional, entirely about how much money the United States has given Ukraine. There's nothing about it being in the United States' interests to defend a democracy, which is kind of traditionally what the Americans would have said, whether or not that's an accurate reflection of policy, that has been the framing. And he's thrown that out the window. And I think in the process is making it really clear to European allies what they can expect from the United States. And again, that's not a huge surprise, but the fact that he's saying it so boldly, I think, is a little bit new and different from the first Trump administration. But I think, the broader ripple effects of this, alongside the way the Trump administration has been treating the United States, one of the United States' closest allies in Canada, the way it has been treating Mexico, in these first few weeks, month, I guess we're up to, of the administration, is Trump telling us exactly who he is and, what kind of ally Trump's America is. And it does seem like this is still coming as a bit of a shock to the United States' traditional allies, not least of which is Australia. But this is the reality. This is how Trump treats allies. He sees every relationship as transactional and is only interested in what he can get out of it politically or economically. That is something about Trump that is entirely predictable.
So moving on from the international rules-based order, I want to talk about order in the United States. And obviously, while all of this has been happening, Trump's exacting his domestic agenda, which includes Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency, which isn't a real department, tearing through the US federal government and firing federal public servants. How many people have lost their jobs so far? Do we even know? Is there any kind of accurate reporting of this?
Look, there are a lot of numbers flying around, Eb, and we've got to be careful because this is such a, movable feast, I suppose. But, I was having a look in preparation for our discussion, and there's one really good breakdown in the New Yorker magazine, which suggests that 30,000 federal workers, US federal workers, have been given notice, which is an awful lot of people. A lot of them, if you break it down, are workers who've been on probation. So they've been kind of unilaterally let go because their contracts allow it. Some of those are resignations as well, which is, part of the intention that you make it so unpleasant to be in those workplaces that people leave voluntarily. But it's a huge number of people across really critical roles as well. To just give one specific example, in the Department of Health and Human Services, which is now being overseen by Bobby Kennedy Jr., 2,800 people have been fired in even just the last week, I think it is. 1,500 of those were probationary. And if you break that down even further, 10% of the Centers for Disease Control workforce has been fired. And those are the people who oversee things like ensuring the safety of medical devices. So these are pretty important roles, highly skilled people who are being given the flick. And I think the repercussions of that for the functioning of the federal government, for the functioning of American society more broadly, are hugely wide-ranging and kind of hard to get your head around as it's happening so quickly. But the numbers themselves are pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, and I've just been really struck by the lack of, I guess, any type of discernment in who it is that's being let go. There seems to be no assessment of if the person being fired has any kind of critical role. It's just, I guess it's efficient, just firing people indiscriminately. But yeah, perhaps it will take a little while for some of the repercussions of that to truly be understood. I can imagine things in the health department, public health, it's pretty obvious when things go wrong there.
Yeah, it is. And, I'm sure listeners will have seen on social media, there have been threads written by employees that have been fired about, the critical role they play in doing things like tracing listeria outbreaks, when people start dying from an illness and they'll trace that illness back to, a particular product, like people who do those kinds of critical jobs that literally save people's lives. Like, it's no exaggeration to say that those are life-saving jobs have been unilaterally fired. But that's the mentality that Musk and, his cronies are bringing to this quote unquote department. It's a Silicon Valley slash and burn mentality that just has no regard for the actual human consequences of what they're doing.
If you don't answer, like you're sort of semi-fired or you're fired, because a lot of people are not answering because they don't even exist.
Some of the agency heads instructed their employees not to respond because they were waiting on further guidance, but Elon Musk's tweet said a failure to respond would be taken as a resignation, so there's been a disconnect in communications.
Only things such as perhaps Marco at State Department where they have very confidential things, or the FBI where they're working on confidential things. And they don't mean that in any way combatively with Elon. They're just saying there are some people that you don't want to really have them tell you what they're working on last week.
And what did you make of, I saw reports of that email that got sent out to federal government employees saying, send us 5 dot points on what you achieved last week. And then Elon on X, on Twitter, saying if people don't respond to this, we're going to just take that as a resignation. But then people like the FBI kind of saying, no, but this doesn't refer to us. It seems to be incredibly haphazard how they're approaching all this. Exactly how much chaos is this creating? And I guess, is that the point?
I think that's entirely the point, Eb, and Musk, I think, sent that letter as such a clear signal about the role he's playing as well. That's exactly what he did at Twitter when he first started there. He sent that email, he forced people to come in person to see him, to give him a page on, how valuable they are. So it's that exactly, as we were just discussing, this kind of Silicon Valley slash and burn mentality that assumes you can assess value in those really kind of black and white terms. And, what did you achieve last week? Well, working for the FBI or the Center for Diseases Control doesn't kind of fit into standard tech bro KPIs. And so they will assume that those people are irrelevant or inefficient or whatever. But that is the whole point, to create that kind of chaos, to create cultural upheaval as well in order to consolidate power. This is literally undermining the institutions of American democracy, of society more broadly.
Well, and it strikes me as a huge security risk as well. The fact that the FBI director had to step in to be like, don't respond to this. I can imagine a list of FBI agents, who knows where all these emails are going to or how secure that would be. The security implications, not only for things like that email, but also the access to different sets of data and algorithms, that the US government is using. There's a big chance that this could go really spectacularly wrong quite quickly, I would imagine.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And, the privacy implications are huge as well when these people have access to so much data on federal employees, for example. And, when they are particularly going after diversity, equity and inclusion programs, for example, aggressively doing that, that has real implications for the safety of people who might have participated in those programs. And, is also likely illegal as well. It's likely a breach of the Privacy Act. So there's those kind of human security implications, exactly as you said, in terms of the FBI and, that kind of information being insecure and accessible for everyone. And I think, there is an argument that a lot of that information should be accessible, but it's really important to say that, these people, Musk and his cronies, they're not interested in that kind of transparency that they promise. They're interested in their own access to that information as a vehicle to power. So yeah, it's a huge mess and the implications are massive and they do not care. They're clearly not worried about the legal implications or the security implications or the implications for people's lives, when they're messing with Treasury payment systems and Social Security payment systems, which are, again, literally life and death matters for many people. Yeah, they don't care.
Perhaps I should have raised this when we were talking about Europe, but I guess I shouldn't be shocked, but Elon Musk backing in far-right parties across the globe, including Alternative for Deutschland, which has been much more popular in the German national elections. I mean, do you think that's just the beginning? And what is Elon trying to achieve with those kind of interventions?
I would start by saying, Eb, we cannot underestimate the scale of Elon Musk's ambition. He effectively, I think, sees himself as almost having total control of, the institutions of US politics, as we were just discussing, but his ambition is global, almost like literally about leaving the earth. Like, this is how much power he wants to consolidate. So he is busy, as you indicated, supporting, lifting up far-right networks, far-right parties across Europe, the most obvious place being in Germany, where he is, speaking at party launches for the AfD, effectively encouraging Germans to vote for them, in what is kind of effectively an effort at regime change. There was this really interesting piece in The Nation this week about exactly that, that Trump kind of came to power promising that the United States wouldn't engage in regime change, it wouldn't be seeking out foreign wars, but that's effectively what Musk is trying to do in places like Germany, in the UK, in the way that he's talking about the Labour government there. So I think that's the scale, again, of his ambition, is kind of leading effectively a global resurgence of the far right, of being that kind of messiah. But it's been, I think, heartening and really interesting to see pushback coming from those democracies that Musk is, trying to involve himself in, not the least of which is Germany, where, there were suggestions that the AfD would get something like 30% of the vote, and in the end they've got about 20. So his interference there hasn't necessarily had a huge effect, but that doesn't mean that it's not dangerous or that he's not kind of learning from that process. And we've seen other administration officials like Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, and JD Vance, the Vice President, openly talk about how supportive they are of these moves. So I think it's deeply concerning for democracies across the world that, they are doing this kind of attempt at regime change, but the pushback, is heartening and, demonstrates that it is possible to push back against them.
We're talking about fraud, waste, abuse, and when a president can't look for fraud and waste and abuse, we don't have a country anymore. So we're very disappointed with the judges that would make such a ruling.
Vice President J.D. Vance disputing their judicial authority, writing, judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power.
And this has many concerned that the country is headed for a constitutional crisis just 3 weeks into Trump's second term.
I want to go now to the US and the courts and the Trump administration, because Trump officials have really gone on the offensive against parts of the judicial branch of the US government, really questioning the authority of judges that rule against Trump and decisions and appointments and executive orders. A lot of those are being challenged through the courts. It just strikes me, I guess, that the US could be headed pretty quickly towards a kind of constitutional crisis, because I don't know about you, but I really don't have much confidence that if a court rules against Trump, that he feels bound by what courts have found. Do you think things are as dire as that, or am I just overreacting?
I think one of the things Trump has been really effective at, and that the US media in particular has enabled him to do, is gaslighting, to kind of say that, or to convince people that this is normal, or to normalize this idea of treating the courts the way he does, so that you do question your own assessment of how bad it is, but it's really bad. It's really terrible. Trump is making it really clear that he doesn't particularly care what the courts have to say, or that he's confident that he can use the legal system, he can use the judges that he appointed the last time around to get what he wants, So in cases where judges are pushing back against moves that are fairly clearly illegal, and that is happening, as you said, there are heaps of legal challenges to his executive orders in particular, he will push back, he will go after individual judges. He will basically kind of sick his supporters on them and make their lives incredibly difficult, in the confidence that, as those cases move up the courts and potentially eventually get to the Supreme Court, he has a court that will support him in what he wants to do. And the Supreme Court has done that consistently. We saw that fairly recently, and we've talked about this on the show before, Eb, where, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, even though there was some noise beforehand about, judges being reasonable and adhering to constitutional
and to precedents.
Adhering to precedents, exactly. But they've shown really clearly that they won't do that. And I think, if we go back to that Supreme Court ruling around presidential immunity, which found that, a president can be considered immune from quote unquote official acts. That's clearly had the effect on Trump of, making him just not worried at all about legal consequences.
That he's got a blank check essentially to do whatever he likes.
Effectively, that it seems that, that's how he feels about it. And that's clearly filtering down as well, I think, to Elon Musk and DOGE and those employees who are acting as if they have no care or interest in the legal consequences of what they're doing when, arguably they're kind of breaking laws all over the place. They're clearly not worried about the consequences. And that is pretty concerning in terms of, what happens when the legal system does start to push back, when state appointed judges, start issuing freezes on executive orders. Are they going to ignore those orders? And some judges are already saying, the Trump administration is ignoring this order to unfreeze billions in federal funds or whatever it is. But Trump is clearly confident he can use that system and has people around him who are openly calling for him to defy it, including his vice president who, tweeted not too long ago that, judges have no right of judicial oversight on the executive branch, which is quite clearly, if you follow that to its logical conclusion, a call for the end of constitutional law and the constitutional order in the United States.
Like it's dissolving the separation of powers entirely, that the president is the law, basically.
Exactly. And, it's coming to the point now where official White House accounts and Trump are tweeting pictures of him, AI-generated pictures of him literally wearing a crown. This is the point that we are at and how they feel about the rule of law and the institutions of US democracy. That doesn't mean that collapse is imminent, but it does mean that, things are as bad as you instinctively think they are.
Yeah. And I guess in some respects, paying attention to all this, I have expected some of this, but even I have been shocked by the kind of scale and the pace at which all this is happening. It's very much kind of a shock and awe approach, I guess, to overwhelm people. I want to turn now to the United States' relationship with Australia, because last week Trump signed an executive order promising retaliatory tariffs against foreign governments who attempt to regulate US technology companies, and Australia's certainly been at the forefront of that with things like our news media bargaining code, but also other efforts that we have to kind of ban access to social media for kids under 16, other e-safety measures, those kinds of things. How much of a concern is this for Australia in the context of, I guess, all the other tariffs that we're being threatened with and the relationship as a whole, I guess?
Look, I think, Eb, this is another clear indication of what are often described as the common values of Australia's relationship with the United States coming under challenge. That concept of common values is always a bit of a dicey one, I suppose, generally, because we do have different ideas about the extent of free speech. For example, the US would be considered far more, I guess, libertarian than Australian views necessarily on things like free speech. So that kind of clash, I suppose, has always been there. But what this does is highlight it much more strongly, I suppose. And Australia and the US, or US companies more specifically, have clashed over this issue before, and not necessarily under the Trump administration. But I think this order is perhaps a little bit different because of the relationship that the Trump administration has with those tech companies. Zuckerberg, Musk, Jeff Bezos, they were all, front and center at Trump's inauguration, which tells you exactly where power lies. So I think it's really important to recognize that, this executive order directed quite specifically against Australia, but also against Europe, which has, made efforts to regulate this kind of stuff as well, is not about necessarily the United States' national interest. It's about the interests of these particular companies and even those particular individuals. So I think it's important to kind of, I guess, see it in that light and recognize it for what it is. That this is about wealth and power for a couple of individuals, and fighting back against it in that way, I think, is of course really important for Australia, and the Australian government has done that before fairly successfully. But I guess there's a lot more tied up in it at this point when, as we were talking about before, the head of Twitter is busy supporting a resurgence of the far right and is, I think, fairly likely to do that in Australia as well, to come at us about free speech, again, quote unquote free speech. So that is, I think, deeply concerning, but there are ways to push back against that, I think, and, for the sake of the integrity of Australian democracy, I think it's really important that we do that.
There's a couple of other things that are happening, but I guess compared to everything else, it feels kind of small beer to end on these things. But I know that the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, is currently in the United States, along with kind of the heads of some of our super funds, talking to some of the kind of heads of some of the biggest financial institutions in the United States. And we've also obviously in the background got AUKUS and, that agreement going forward as well. And I think we shipped out something like $800 million a couple of weeks ago to support American submarine manufacturers. So, I mean, a lot of this, it feels small in comparison to the fast-moving collapse of US democracy. But these are all elements of our relationship where I guess we're either trying to build or wield leverage against the United States and insulate ourselves from some of the chaos. But is it just that we're having to use basically every tool in the toolkit that's available to us to try and create that kind of leverage with our much bigger partner?
Look, I think we actually underestimate in Australia how much leverage we do have in our relationship with the United States. And we have some choices about how to, I suppose, utilise that leverage. So there was a clear attempt, or I think it was a pretty clear attempt to do that with that $800 million that you mentioned, Deb, where, Australia makes the first down payment on what will be a $5 billion deposit, I guess, on those AUKUS submarines to the US shipbuilding industry. So Richard Marles, announced that in his visit to the United States. And then we were showed just how much that leverage mattered when literally a couple of days later, Trump signed that executive order announcing tariffs on steel and aluminium with no carve-outs, no exceptions for Australia. So, clearly not enough leverage there, or you don't get enough leverage for handing over $800 million. But if you kind of, I guess, zoom out more broadly to look at their economic relationship, you can see where that leverage might work with Trump. And there's a lot to be said about finding leverage with Trump in order to insulate ourselves from the worst effects of what he is doing.
And as we've said, he's very transactional. So,
yeah, exactly. And, you could see that worked in some way when the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese had that weird conversation with him that resulted in Trump talking about how many planes Australia buys from the United States. You can effectively plant those things in his head and I guess get him to view that relationship more favourably. But I think the way to kind of, I guess, flip that and understand our leverage a little bit differently is to look at things like superannuation and the Treasurer being in the United States at the moment, because Australian superannuation has a pool of $2.8 trillion to invest. And something like $400 billion of that is already invested in the United States. And Australian super funds are looking to increase that significantly to about $1 trillion by the 2030s. That's a lot of money and a lot of leverage, I think, comes with that kind of investment, which is being framed in some of the Australian media about a kind of offering, I suppose, to the Trump administration to ingratiate Australian business and Australian economic interests with the United States, where, you can actually flip that and say, well, actually, we've got heaps of money to invest.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll do that, if the United States is acting in our mutual interests when it comes to things like free trade and not using retaliatory tariffs against us. And we can see where that kind of approach is working for the United States' other allies, including Canada, for example, which, after dancing around it for a little while, announced its own retaliatory tariffs against the United States, which, would you believe, was actually quite popular in Canada and led to a significant uptick in the polls for the Canadian Liberal Party, which was staring down an electoral loss. So, you know, there are political benefits, I suppose, to pushing back against the Trump administration and using the significant economic leverage that we do have to not just seek out concessions, but to act in our own interests and to talk to the Trump administration and, probably more importantly, other people in the United States with an interest in the functioning of US democracy about where those mutual interests lie. So, you know, that requires bravery. It requires thinking about the relationship a little bit differently. But I think there are indications in Australia that is starting to shift, partly because Trump is so bad. You know, how bad he is becoming increasingly kind of undeniable, even for the most rusted on supporters of Australia's relationship with the United States.
Middle of a hostile government takeover. I wanna talk about it, but I've been late for work. And if you're saying, wait a minute, who we have to stop this? We have one, but you didn't want that lady in office.
So to finish up, I guess I wanted to touch on the response to this kind of shock and awe tactics in the United States. Obviously, a lot is happening, and I can imagine that there's also a lot of pushback happening on the ground there. What do we know about how people are responding and fighting back against some of the worst excesses of the early days of the second Trump administration?
Look, Eb, there's a lot of organising happening on the ground in civil society organisations. You know, we've talked before about the organising that's happening to protect immigrants, for example, or people who are kind of facing the worst effects of immigration raids, for example, or legal challenges. So that kind of organising is happening. A lot of it's happening in the courts as well. In the women's movement, there's a lot of organising happening as well around reproductive rights still, because there are deep concerns that more is coming in that space, because that's been flagged by people in the Trump administration. So that organising is happening. There's been a lot of high-profile pushback, of course, from Democrats like Bernie Sanders, who are talking really clearly about things like kleptocracy and, you know, exactly what the Trump administration is doing. But I think, you know, having said that, still in the Democratic Party more broadly, there has been a reluctance to fight back really strongly. You know, I think Democrats are still unsure of how to confront Trump, especially in Congress, to the point where there was an Axios report last week, I think it was, that outlined how, again, this is a quote, how pissed some senior Democrats were that people were calling their officers, you know, motivated by grassroots civil society organisations, mobilising them to call their officers, call their representatives and ask them to do more to fight back against Trump. And this report suggested that, you know, senior Democrats were pissed that was happening because, as they saw it, there wasn't really much they could do because they don't have a majority in Congress. So I think some of the Democratic response has been really disappointing to a lot of Americans who are trying to push back, but that I think is changing and will continue to change again, you know, as Trump continues to show us how bad he is. And some of that is coming from federal workers themselves who have been protesting for weeks about their treatment and the implications of their firings and what that will mean for American life. So I think we'll see increasing pushback, and that pushback is supported from outside as well. You know, we started this conversation by talking about pushback from democracies in Europe, from Germany, from the UK. And so that kind of network building, you know, in contrast to the network building being done on the far right, is happening as well. And so that is heartening. It's exhausting, of course, for the people involved, but it's entirely necessary when we're talking again about the worst excesses of the Trump administration. And again, I guess just to kind of round it out, the Australian government, given our close relationship with the United States beyond the Trump administration, has a lot of leverage to use there, and it's in, I would argue that it's in Australian interest to support the institutions of American democracy and to work with people who have an interest in them surviving and thriving.
Well, thanks very much for joining us today, Emma.
Pleasure. Thanks, Eb.
If you want to hear more about the United States and global politics, if you can bear it, you can subscribe to Emma's podcast, After America. New episodes drop every Tuesday. It's a fantastic listen, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts or via the link in the show notes. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today, and you can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on social media. We're at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky and at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS, on Instagram and Twitter. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.